Okay, so we will get started tonight. Hello everyone. I'll start with Osio Nagad, Gigag Kamamatawan, Jalagi Gason, Yonig Gason, Kirby Williams, G Jalagi, Wado. Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kirby Williams. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and I currently serve as the outreach coordinator for the Native American program with Legal Aid of Nebraska. We are grateful to be joining the Ponca Tribe Domestic Violence Program tonight, the Santee DTSU Domestic Violence Program, and the Winnebago Tribe Domestic Violence Intervention Program, so that we can take on this collaborative approach throughout this series, coming together to really try and address this crisis throughout this month. So it's been a really helpful series. We've gotten a lot of great feedback, and we just really appreciate all of you who've been able to join us either live or through the recordings. So tonight we are specifically going to focus on how do we move forward, and how do we heal from this crisis, and how do we get assistance for folks who maybe are survivors of violence, so that hopefully we don't actually get to the point of a missing and murdered situation. How can we be there for our communities right now, so that we can start to try and address this crisis? So talking about some of the dynamics of trauma specifically, just to kind of give us an idea of what that looks like, especially in relation to symptomology. And then we'll talk about best practices. So for service providers, for community members, and even for survivors themselves, how can we move forward in a way that is very trauma informed and victim-centered and culturally relevant, to try and make sure that, again, we are combating a lot of the triggers that come with this. And then also, we want to take a moment to understand how can we engage the non-Native community as allies of the Indigenous community, because it's really important to recognize that this crisis specifically has been something that really the Native community and Indigenous community have been at the forefront of, and we should be at the forefront of. But it's going to take engagement from non-Indigenous people and non-Native communities to make sure that we actually do effectively address this crisis. We as Native people cannot be alone in trying to address this crisis. So how to engage folks in that manner. Before we get started, also just want to say, we are recording this session. Also, please feel free to stay muted throughout, just so we can keep the recording consistent. And then we will have time for questions at the end. And hopefully we'll hear from some of the domestic violence programs tonight. We'll definitely be highlighting contact information and resources for folks. But we also just want to recognize that this is a very heavy topic. This is a very difficult time. This has been a very hectic month, I can say. And especially when we're talking about trauma, that can be very difficult for us to take on a lot of the time, especially with everything else that's been going on throughout. Just in general outside of this session. So just want to give everyone a trigger warning tonight that we are going to be talking about trauma. We are going to be talking about some of the things affiliated with trauma. So if at any point you need to log off or just can't take this on tonight, or maybe if you're watching the recording and you need to hit pause and take a lot of breaks, please do so. Please take care of yourselves. I will never be offended if you have to log off. Because I just really want everyone to take care of themselves, especially for those of you who may also be trauma survivors, because speaking as a trauma survivor myself, this is always a really tough presentation to get through. So we're all going to get through it together, just deep breaths one at a time. So starting off, want to kind of, again, ground us in this mentality of understanding trauma. But, that's become kind of a buzzword that a lot of folks are using nowadays. People, kind of throw it around a lot. But a lot of people don't actually understand, not only what trauma is, but what the actual prevalence of trauma looks like. So when we look at trauma statistics and how likely it is that we experience trauma, even across the United States, it's estimated that approximately 70% of adults in the US have experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. So there's a very high likelihood that the majority of the US population alone is going to experience some kind of trauma. It's estimated that about 20% of those individuals will develop the symptomology and criteria for a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. So the actual formal symptomology, where a lot of people are experiencing trauma, but when we see that as a hindrance in requiring diagnosis, We see about, an estimated 20% will develop that. And that definitely is something that the Native American community experiences at a higher prevalence rate than others. So we actually see rates of PTSD being at about 22% versus the general population, looking at that at about 8% experience with PTSD. So again, we see that huge disproportionality where this community is being impacted. We also know that our Native youth, this trauma starts young a lot of the times. Native children are 2.5 times more likely to experience trauma compared to their non-Native peers. There was actually a really good study that was conducted a few years back in which they interviewed Native children and Native youth, and they were actually reporting, so Native youth, before they reached the age of 18, and most of these were young children, were already reporting an average of over 4 lifetime traumas before they even reach adulthood. And about 10% of those who were interviewed met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So the symptomology was pretty severe. So a lot of times I get the question of, well, like, why is this happening? Why are we seeing such a high exposure rate in this one population? And, it's traumatic events that occur, which we'll talk about, what traumatic events we're talking about, but it's also looking at really what you can see for all marginalized communities. So that overarching cultural, historical, and intergenerational traumas make this population and other marginalized populations more vulnerable for PTSD. That's why we see these high rates. And so it's important to recognize, what does the landscape and prevalence actually look like so that we can start to combat it. So when we start to talk about a general definition for what is trauma, trauma is the emotional reaction to a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So it's when we have an event such as those listed here, and the emotional reaction that oftentimes comes with that. That is what we classify as trauma. And there are several different sort of categories, so to speak, when we talk about a traumatic event. A lot of people have in their minds, 1 or 2 instances, but there are a lot of ways that we can take in trauma or experience trauma. So the first one listed here, talking about relationship violence, and especially, sexual relationship violence. So things like a sexual assault, childhood sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, all of that absolutely contributes to trauma. Interpersonal network traumatic experiences is when someone may not be experiencing the trauma directly, but they are still impacted by it. So when we talk about the missing and murdered crisis, and we talk about these families, they may personally not be directly experiencing the violence and that trauma, but they are still going through a trauma because their loved one is missing, or they may find out about a traumatic death of a loved one. So that is still a trauma, and that is still something that we need to provide support to that family and to those loved ones who remain. Interpersonal violence is when we focus a lot more on things like physical assaults, child abuse, threats of violence, things like that, which may or may not be intimate partner related. Exposure to organized violence. So this, especially when we talk about refugee populations or civilians in a war zone, we see a lot of that in the news right now. That is absolutely a trauma. Participation in organized violence is when we see this trauma coming out of our combat veterans. This is what most people think of when we talk about PTSD or we talk about trauma. Most people think of soldiers or war veterans. And that is absolutely a trauma that they can come back with. But that's what this categorizes as. And then other life-threatening traumatic events. So things like natural disasters. So I grew up in Northeast Oklahoma. I actually grew up just over the border from Joplin, Missouri. And some of you may remember, I guess it's about 10 years ago now, the Joplin tornado and the trauma that came out of that. We see that especially with hurricane victims and survivors. A lot of trauma can come out of even just experiencing a natural disaster, or even people who have a close call with a life-threatening trauma, such as like a really close call car crash or something that leaves someone shaken. So all of these events can absolutely be contributors to trauma. And then I want to also take a moment to talk about historical and intergenerational trauma. And I know we spoke about this in the first session for this series, but just to, again, keep us in this context of talking about trauma and how it manifests, it's important to recognize how historical trauma and intergenerational trauma contributes to this high rates of PTSD like we've talked about. and something that we can continue to see across time that affects us. So historical trauma, this reference to that cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across lifespans and generations emanating in this sort of massive group trauma where we have, groups who have been targeted for violence. They have been targeted by white supremacy and systemic racism. That is absolutely what historical trauma is looking at. So it's looking at how this group has been targeted across time. And you see this not only with the Native American community, you see this with the Black and African American community, you see this with the Asian community here in the United States, you see this with the Jewish community, you see this with any kind of targeting of a certain group. Intergenerational trauma, sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. I tend to fall into the line of thinking where historical trauma is looking at the group in particular and how that looks across time. Intergenerational trauma is looking across generations in one family. So for instance, when we look at the Native American community, we can look at, say, one generation where the grandparents were maybe kidnapped and sent to boarding schools. And then when they came back, how did that impact them, which then, how did that impact their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and so on and so forth? We can continue to see that trauma manifest throughout this family. And then we also have to recognize that the trauma hasn't stopped. People hear historical and they think that means the past, and it's ongoing. Native Americans in particular continue to experience events that contribute to trauma, such as systemic racism, targeted legislation to eliminate our tribal sovereignty and undermine who we are as individuals and as a culture. And then we also see this in the high rates of suicide and poverty and substance abuse. So these serious consequences happen not only, from a social level, from a governmental level, a psychological level, an emotional level, but also from a physical level, literally. So I get it a lot of times when we talk about, again, people hear historical, they think the past. And so they think we should just be able to get over this. But there is actually, for those of you who may be more biology oriented, this, traumatic events such as things like family separation and historical loss and racism and violence across generations, that actually does affect DNA over time. So there is actually known as a process known as DNA methylation, which is a biological process in which methyl groups are added to DNA molecules, which can then change gene expression. And so it alters the very foundation of our genetic makeup, and that continues to get passed down through the continuing generations. So that's how we are seeing these things like decreased life expectancy, higher rates of PTSD, mental health disparities, suicide. This is literally continuing to have a physical impact on us. And I don't say all of this to scare you all, and especially for the Native community members, I don't say all of this to make it seem hopeless. I say all of this with the mentality of this is how it's continuing to impact us. And we have to be very cognizant of that. And we have to be very mindful of that if we're actually going to affect change and overcome this. I also like to point out that if we experience our historical trauma, we also, a lot of times it's pointed out that we also carry on that historical resiliency, because for those of us who are still here, we are still here, we are very resilient. For PTSD symptoms, so specifically looking at symptomology here, it tends to get categorized into 4 sort of different symptom categories. And so PTSD can include things like intrusion symptoms. So this is where we hear about things like flashbacks, prolonged psychological distress, memories, flashback dreams. I personally fall into this category, especially with my sleep. I have a lot of times whenever I'm triggered, I will have very distressing dreams. Persistent avoidance of associated stimuli. So this is where we are avoiding our triggers, whether that's internal, so things like memories or thoughts or feelings, and external. So like we are avoiding certain locations or people or other reminders. I personally always get triggered anytime I see a photo of my perpetrator. So I have to avoid that at all costs. And especially that avoidance of associated stimuli, that's why we give things like trigger warnings, because we want folks to be mindful before they walk into a session like this, where they understand what the content is. And so that if they know they can't take that on right now, that they can not engage, or that they will be aware that they may need to look out for physical reactions or emotional reactions they may be experiencing so they can take care of themselves. Negative alterations in cognitions and mood. So this is where we see a lot of comorbidity with things like anxiety and depression that can come out of PTSD and traumatic experiences. So things like really negative beliefs about oneself, or diminished interest in significant activities, even feelings of detachment, or feeling like there's an persistent inability to experience positive emotions. All of that can also resonate here. And then marked alterations in arousal and reactivity. So the reality of trauma, and especially the reality of those who have PTSD, is that your brain, when it experiences trauma, is doing everything it can to try and protect you. So that means that a lot of different areas of your brain can be hyperactive or underreactive. And so that's where we can oftentimes see this manifest as like hypervigilance or exaggerated startle responses. These are two of mine in particular. My partner, I always joke that I'm going to put a cowbell around his neck so that I know where he is at all times, because every now and then he can just move somewhere. And if I didn't expect him to be there, it can startle me, and it can take me a little bit to calm down. We also see this with things like, irritable behavior, angry outbursts. We see this with problems with concentration or sleep disturbance. All of this can be impacted when we talk about PTSD symptomology. Other responses that can come out of trauma, focusing, specifically on physical symptoms. So a lot of trauma survivors can experience things like, really tense, aching pain, especially stiffness in the muscles, especially like in the shoulders and the neck area, can be a lot of tension. Again, we talked about being easily startled and difficulty calming down, but overall just fatigue, or becoming more easily tired from everyday tasks that, I've worked with a lot of trauma survivors, and there's always this response of like, I used to be able to do this all the time, and now I just get so tired. That fatigue can definitely drag on. Insomnia, disturbed sleep, and we know that disturbed sleep also contributes to fatigue and contributes to mood and emotion. So that also doesn't help here. Feeling on edge, difficulty concentrating or breathing, and then also avoiding eye contact. That can absolutely be a form of trauma response. So it's not to say that someone will experience all of these, but they may experience some combination of these, or maybe just a few of these, but really recognizing that trauma manifests very differently for different people. And so being very mindful that what you think trauma is going to look like, it might not always look that way. And that doesn't diminish what that person has experienced. And it doesn't diminish, the distress they may be experiencing. Emotional and psychological symptoms. So you may, one of the really common ones I have is shock, denial, or disbelief, or really downplaying what's happened. This mentality of, no, I'm fine. I can't be a trauma survivor. I'm not oh, someone has experienced far worse than me. A lot of that can come into play here. Confusion, difficulty concentrating. We talked about, a lot of anxiety, fear, depression being comorbid here. Guilt or shame, or, a lot of self-blame. I always say there's no one who can blame themselves like a trauma survivor can. And so again, being very mindful of that. Social withdrawal, feelings of hopelessness, sadness, and especially this feeling of disconnection or feeling numb. We see this also with times where things are very stressful. So for instance, with the pandemic, that is a very stressful time, and especially for trauma survivors, may have been experiencing, whether it was related to the pandemic or not, may have been experiencing that sort of heightened disconnection, or that feeling like they don't want to feel, or they just aren't able to be in touch with their emotions, and because they're in trauma mode and they're trying to protect themselves because they've been here before. So again, all of these can kind of come into play in some kind of combination or variation. So again, I say all of that not to provide this barrier and not to make it seem hopeless, but to help us understand, what does this trauma look like? And so now we want to talk about, well, how do we tackle that? How do we address this? And how do we start to move forward from a sense of healing? And how do we start to come together as community? And how can we better support survivors? And how can survivors get help? And so I want to talk for a quick second here about two areas of thought when it comes to really how especially we should be working with trauma survivors and survivors of violence and the Native community who may be going through a circumstance like this, but also really, I would like to see this become a more normalized approach for everyday life, because we don't know someone's story. We don't know every experience that someone has had. And so it's always important that these are very simple techniques that we can incorporate as service providers and as community members to move forward in a better way and to be in good relation with one another. So the first one I want to talk about is a victim-centered approach. So the difference between these two is victim-centered tends to focus on the individual in front of you and how do we work to empower them. So the focus here is offering them choices, allowing that survivor to make decisions and respecting their choices. So especially when I work with survivors of violence, it's very important that we honor and respect the decisions that they're making, because they're coming out of a situation where their power and sense of control has been taken away by a perpetrator or an abuser. And so it's very important that we give them some of that power and control back, even if we may not like the choices that they make, but we have to respect that they are able to make those choices and empower them with the ability to make choice. Trauma-informed tends to focus on the system overall and how to take into consideration all of the factors that are going to impact that individual. So it's where we are asking ourselves, when this person leaves my office, what are they going to come into contact with? What does their safety plan look like? Do they have a safe place to stay, or are they safe? We really have to focus on being trustworthy and transparent with them, being open and honest, not hiding or evading them or trying to withhold information. What does their peer support look like? Do they have a support network? Do they have folks they can reach out to? Can we hook them up with services that may be helpful for them, or activities? Look at, sort of a collaboration and a mutuality between service providers and community members, again, coming around to support that person. Really focusing again on empowerment of voice and choice. So making sure that when we come in contact with anyone, that we are always enabling them the ability to say no, to say yes, giving them the incentive that they are the ones who are in control here and they get to determine what happens to them. And then also taking into consideration cultural, historical, and gender issues. How does, there are differences in what people experience based on these factors. So things like, I work with a lot of non-Native service providers who serve Native populations, and they sometimes get frustrated. And I'm like, do you understand the history of your organization, or do you understand the history of the services that you've provided, that maybe it doesn't have the best track record? And so there's some historical context that can come into play there. Solutions that work for one group may not work for another group. So how can we look at more culturally relevant services to provide for this person? Gender issues, especially when we talk about, our LGBTQIA+ relatives and folks who are gender non-binary, or who identify as transgender, making sure that we empower them with the ability to have services or to reach out for help that is actually going to be helpful for them and is not going to subject them to even more trauma. And so then when we're working with trauma survivors, again, the focus has to rely on that empowerment and that self-determination. So providing them things like non-judgmental assistance. And again, this is not just for service providers, this is for community members as well. We all have to pitch in here to start building healthier and safer communities. Exercising that self-determination, so giving them that empowerment, identifying ways they can support themselves, helping them with coping mechanisms and coping skills, and giving them resources to make sure that they know they are not alone, but that they are the ones who, we are not their savior, but we are giving them the opportunity to advocate for themselves and to give them every opportunity. So remembering, like I said here, that you are not their savior. And I don't say that to be rude. I say that because if you come off in a way that it seems like you're taking care of everything and making all of the decisions for them, then they may construct this identity that they themselves are helpless, or that they're unable to care for themselves, which increases the likelihood, if we're dealing with a violent situation, that they will go back to their perpetrator or abuser. And it prolongs that ability to get to healing. So it's really, again, about just focusing on the person you have in front of you and how can we empower them. General best practices. So we did talk a little bit about this in the first session, but just want to, again, talk about it more in this context. So first and foremost, prioritizing safety from here on out. Asking our relatives, our community members, or our clients, do you feel safe? And if the answer is no, how can I help you feel safe? I have heard from too many families when we work with missing and murdered cases that, really this is not a question that's normalized, and we need to start asking that so that we can start helping folks find safety in the long run. Speak loudly, clearly, and simply. As I talked about, our brains reacting to trauma, we already talked about difficulty concentrating may be a factor here. We talked about sleep disruption, which we know impacts our cognition. So not in a way to belittle them and not in a way to talk down to them, but just being really mindful that we may need to take some extra time here to make sure that this person is able to take in all these choices and make the best decision for them. Be supportive, listen to what they're saying. This especially can be very difficult for small communities, and I come from a small community where we see a situation in front of us, and we want to say like, oh, I told you that was a bad situation, or I told you not to go there, or I told you this wasn't going to work out, or that person was bad news. But this is not the time for that. This is only the time to listen and support trauma survivors. It is only the time to listen and support the families who are going through a missing and murdered situation, and really making sure that we are instead focusing on how can I help you, not just do you need help, yes or no. Help them identify resources and people who can help outside of yourself, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. Understanding the role of humor, teasing, and emotions. And I say this from both a sense of working with trauma survivors and a sense of working at it from a culturally relevant perspective. So a lot of the times, again, trauma does not look the same from one person to the next. And trauma can manifest very differently. And so we have to be mindful that if the person is not reacting the way we think they should, that doesn't minimize what they've experienced. So for instance, and you find this with a lot of Native communities where our humor is kind of what's gotten us through 500 plus years of genocide. And so I tend to personally make a lot of jokes or to kind of downplay the trauma I've experienced or to try and get through, and that's my coping mechanism. And sometimes it's a little standoffish for other people, but it's just how I get through the day. And so that's not to belittle what others experience. That's not to minimize it in any other way. It's not to make a joke of what's happened to me. It's just my personal coping mechanism. And I've run across several other trauma survivors who that's also their coping mechanism. So recognizing that, again, we may not always behave and react the way you think we should, but you still can come forward and can assist without that judgment. Continuing to remind the survivor or the family that it is never their fault. It's never going to be their fault. I do not care what the circumstances are. This is only the time, again, to listen and support them and to continue to remind them of this. Recognize that there may be some trust resistance. This may be from, again, a survivor mentality where trauma survivors, we don't know what they've been through, especially if they're coming out of a violent relationship. They may not have experienced a safe environment. They may especially have been told by their abuser, their trafficker, that they shouldn't trust anyone else. I've had too many traffickers tell their victims, don't call the cops or don't go get help. Don't even think about going to this resource because if you do, they're going to arrest you or you're going to get in trouble. I'm immune or nobody can touch me kind of mentality. And it scares them. So just recognize that there may be some resistance and it's not personal. From a cultural or historical context, again, we talked about, agencies' history and how a lot of the times, especially when we talk about government agencies, that hasn't always played out well for Native communities or other marginalized communities. So it's not personal, but you have to be able to still show up and still be willing to provide assistance and be patient with that. And then also understanding that it's the survivor's decision moving forward, which means the survivor decides if they get help, survivor decides if they participate in an investigation or press charges, if we're dealing with something like that. Survivor also decides if they go back to an unsafe situation or go back to an abuser or whatever the circumstances may be involved. And that can be really frustrating for us as community members, as supporters, as service providers, but it's part of that empowering trauma survivors and giving them back some of that control. It's honoring their choices and their ability to make that decision. Other general best practices. So this, again, is more to focus on how can we move forward and how can we build better communities. So identifying resources to generally have on hand. I always like to say, you know, if you had someone walk up to you and they identified as a trauma survivor or a domestic violence survivor or a trafficking survivor, would you actually know what to do and who to call? So that's part of why we had this collaborative series, is so that we could give you a lot of the phone numbers that you can call when you're addressing a situation like this. And we'll share those in just a moment. But asking, you know, who can you help direct someone to if they ask for help? Keeping domestic violence program phone numbers readily accessible, keeping the National Trafficking Hotline phone number readily accessible. So even we don't lose those precious minutes, even just Googling it sometimes, or at least knowing what to Google so that you can do it more quickly. Understanding that each person has a unique story. And part of that comes with accepting that you are probably never going to know everyone's story. You are probably never going to know all the details that led to them to coming into contact with you or to disclosing that they have experienced trauma. And that's not for you to pry about. I know that we as human beings can be very nosy sometimes, and we are very curious. I'm from the South, gossip is a pastime. So I understand that curiosity, but it's having to, again, respect the person in front of you and respecting that you are not entitled to that story unless they choose to share it. And also not jumping to conclusions. So not immediately thinking that it's that person's fault that they wound up in a situation like that. Because again, it's never that survivor's fault. Comparing traumas is never a good idea. I see this from an individual standpoint where, you know, we have two different domestic violence survivors. And I oftentimes hear from people like, oh, well, this one person had it way worse than that other person. And that's not helpful here. Again, trauma and the way we experience trauma happens differently for every individual. So for one situation we may look at and think that is the worst of the worst, doesn't take away from the trauma that someone else has experienced. And both of those individuals in this case deserve nothing but respect and safety and help and assistance and anything that we can to provide support for their individual healing from their respective traumas. I also see this from a perspective of comparing other groups that have experienced historical trauma or other marginalized groups that have experienced targeted, genocide or systemic oppression. And that's also never a good idea. I really like the phrase, we're not here to play trauma Olympics, right? And so what we can do is recognize who is being impacted by the current thing that we're raising awareness to. So for instance, with a lot of the police brutality and Black Lives Matter movement, you know, we can respect and uplift that community that is experiencing this heightened rate of violence. When we talk about the missing and murdered Indigenous people situation, you know, it's focusing on that group and the things that they're experiencing. So it's recognizing that we can uplift each other and we can respect each other as we start to address this and not have this be a comparison of who's, you know, experiencing worse, what, when, but just recognizing that we need to help people when they say they need help. Not projecting your personal experiences onto the survivor. So I see this also a lot of times where people say, oh, I'm a survivor of this type of violence. And someone says, oh, me too. And then they just immediately start unloading on this person with all of their personal experiences. It's important to recognize that we have to focus on, again, that victim-centered approach and focusing on that person in front of us and how can we best help them, not just telling them how we think they should be fixing their problems or how they, oh, well, this worked for me, but it might not work for that other person. And so being very mindful of that as well. Other ways to assist trauma survivors. So I usually offer this, especially to service providers who are going to come in contact with trauma survivors, but it's something that I think can also just be helpful to have in mind for community events or when we gather again safely, hopefully in the future. encouraging survivors, to find tasks and activities that are safe and help them establish that sense of routine and that sense of normalcy. So asking first and foremost, what does the survivor enjoy? And having that list of ideas ready to talk about the survivor's interests. So things like when you ask them, oftentimes you'll say, okay, well, what do you like to do? And they'll say, I don't know. And so having a list available, but giving them ideas to help kind of spark that. So things like exercise or working with your hands is very, very helpful. Any kind of creative process can be especially helpful here. So things like art or gardening or sewing or beading. The Ponca tribe has several great classes that they offer for survivors when it comes to like art therapy and sewing classes. Self-care and focusing on different ways that self-care can manifest. And then also talking about ways to cope with triggers. So things like awareness and mindfulness can be really helpful. Downloading meditation apps, grounding in the five senses. So this is actually something that my best friend, I went to a conference, I remember, and I had a trigger warning and I should have walked out, but I actually got triggered at an event, and I barely made it back to my hotel room before I was on the floor, collapsed. And so I called my best friend and I'm barely able to get any words out. And she immediately starts going through this grounding technique with me. And she says, okay, I want you to tell me right now 5 things that you see. I want you to tell me 4 things that you hear, 3 things that you smell, 2 things that you taste. And she just brought me down back to my current situation and back into my current reality, and took me out of that trigger and took me out of the flashback that I was experiencing. So this is something that can be extremely helpful for trauma survivors. This can be extremely helpful. I've seen people even use this with kids who are having like a temper tantrum. It can just be really helpful to kind of bring folks back into the present moment. And again, this is something that my best friend, who has no clinical training, has no psychological training, she just had this technique and was able to provide and to offer that when I was feeling triggered. And then things like affirmations, having things that are really healing for folks to repeat to themselves. So things like, I am safe, I am well, I am okay. My personal mantra a lot of times is women are sacred. That mentality that, especially for those of us as Native people, that we are resilient, that we are going to get through this, that I come from a long line of strong Native people, that I will be okay. It may feel, we talk about affirmations and some people may be a little hesitant to engage in that, may feel like, oh, I'm going to talk to myself. But even just having that moment to breathe and to say, I am safe, can make all the difference in bringing someone back down. And then also having tactile things on hand. So something that, again, like I talked about, working with your hands can be really helpful here. A lot of times, people have things like fidget spinners or that string game, whatever it is, like where you play cat's cradle or something. I used to make the Eiffel Tower with my teeth or something. Play-Doh. I personally have a pop socket on the back of my phone, and you will notice me sometimes whenever I'm getting anxious or nervous, I tend to play with the pop socket. But it can, again, just kind of help ground us in that moment and help us have something else to focus on. Shifting into how do we move forward for this mentality of self-determination and healing. So really focusing on moving forward as an Indigenous community and moving forward as Native individuals, or really any individual. What are some of the things that we can focus on? So those concepts of self-determination and self-governments, that we are the ones who are in control here. We are the ones who determine how our futures are going to look. And we can promote that in our communities. We can promote that sense that we can get back to our pre-contact ways. We can get back to the way our communities used to take care of each other and used to support each other and uplift each other. I personally really identify with the 7th generation mentality, and a lot of different tribes have a different interpretation of this. But the way that this teaching was gifted to me is this mentality that in everything you do and in every decision you make and step you take, think about how that's going to impact the world 7 generations from now. So for instance, I do anti-violence work because my hope is that 7 generations from now, And even with successive generations, my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, so on and so forth, will not have to deal with the violence I experience, and hopefully that we will have these safer, violent-free communities, that we can get back to that. There's also that I've heard this come into play with this mentality that you are a seventh generation today, that you have ancestors who prayed for you and, you know, hoped that you would be okay today. And so having that mentality that you have that resiliency with you, focusing on healing ourselves so that we can build those better futures and healing our communities. So I am very much an advocate for you cannot take care of others until you take care of yourself. And so promoting that sense of healing and making that more normalized, keeping up our cultural practices. So for those of us in the Native community, we know that our cultural practices can be extremely healing. So if you're a service provider or a community member organizing events like hand games, you know, art talks or art classes, language, our tribal languages are so incredibly healing, and having those things accessible for folks so that they can connect back to that and to have that. Educating yourself so you can educate others, educating yourselves on things like trauma, educating yourself on how do we heal and how can we promote those better communities so that you can then spread that knowledge and spread that healing as well. When we talk about self-care, you know, it's important to think about these things from a mental standpoint. So things like promoting those cultural practices, counseling, supportive healing for our families and our friends and our communities, but also from a physical sense, you know, are we promoting good exercise and eating right and, you know, really promoting actual rest and relaxation, not just free time, but actual rest. Doing nothing is a form of rest. And we need to, I really, really hope coming out of this pandemic that we start normalizing that a little more. That we all need that in order to go at 1000% again. And then thinking back to how our ancestors handled violence. That's one of the most helpful things that continues to guide me in this work, especially when we're faced with something like the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. You know, this thing that feels like it's been happening for over 500 years and it's devastating and it rocks our communities and it's horrible. And so it's very easy to feel like we're never going to overcome this, but I have to remind myself that we didn't have this prior to that Western European contact, right? Our ancestors knew how to handle violence. We knew how to support our communities and how to support survivors, and we can get back to that. And so it's just reminding ourselves that we can get back to this mentality. For those of you who do not identify as Indigenous, you may be sitting there asking yourselves, okay, well, how can I be a good ally? How can I actually support this movement and this community? And so some of the things that I like to offer is, you know, educating yourself. So listening to tribal communities when we tell you about our histories and learning about our tribal communities. At the very least, you can go to, if you Google it, it's like native-land.ca, and you can Google whose lands are you on and learn about that. Using your privilege to speak out, even when you may be scared or it may be inconvenient, and standing in actual solidarity with us, not from a performative aspect, not from just a, you know, repost on social media, but actually doing the work and saying, how can I help? And being prepared to do the work, because it should not be on those of us who are members of this community to educate you and to take on that burden. Not denying our history and our lived experiences. So when someone says, you know, something you've done is harmful or expresses that they are offended, or says that, you know, this is still impacting us, not underplaying that, recognizing that even when we mess up or we say things and we offend when it's not intentional, not to justify it, but to just apologize and do better. We are not perfect human beings, right? And we can all sort of take a note out of this for as we work together. And then moving away also from this mentality that if you don't fit this Western European patriarchal society, that it's not normal. Again, there are so many other cultural practices and so many different ways that we can operate in this world, and that doesn't make them wrong just because they don't fit this Western European patriarchal mode. So just recognizing that we can embrace these differences, especially when that's relevant to that cultural group. Unhelpful practices. So this is for not just non-natives, but also just really any community member or service provider. So unhelpful practices, things like focusing the narrative on yourself instead of those in need. So I tend to ask myself whenever people get involved, especially with the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis, I usually have to ask, would you be here if the cameras were off? If there was no documentation, would you still be here? Why do you want to be involved in this? Who is already doing this work, and how can you assist and support them? So it's making sure that we are not here to take it for our own advantage. It's centering the voices and stories of these families who are going through this, of these tribal communities who have been rocked to their core, of Native survivors of violence. It's making sure that we are not centering ourselves. And so it's asking yourself, is this really about me? Is this actually affecting me directly? Not just that you feel bad, but is the problem you're trying to uplift really affecting you? And if the answer is no, then you probably don't need to be the one talking, and you need to search out for others who it is affecting to hear from them, compensate them for their time, their energy, their knowledge, and learn to really decenter yourself and go from it as a means of being a supporter. Recognizing that we do not need saviors. This comes again for those of us who are service providers and we want to solve all the problems. And this also comes for people outside of the Native community who hear about our struggles and say, well, I want to go in and I want to solve everything and I know how to fix you. We don't need your fixes. We need you to help us in the way that we have said we need help, right? And so it's recognizing that and coming from it, again, from this sense of, I am here to help, I am here to listen, and I am here to support you how you tell me you need best support, not for me to tell you how to heal. And then this last one in particular, this is something that, again, everybody really needs to focus on, and it's not profiting off of our stories. So this is something that I've seen a lot of lately, and I know within the Native community, we've been calling each other out on this, not selling missing and murdered Indigenous peoples movement merchandise. So I have seen this on Amazon and other places like that where, you know, they slap a red handprint on a t-shirt or a mask or something and they try and sell it. And that's not to say that if you're going to sell things or whatever, that you can't do that, but you better be making sure that the majority of the proceeds, if not all of them, are going to support the families, are going to research, are going to violence prevention. There should be no profit coming from someone who sells things like that. And it's calling out folks, even within our own communities of, okay, you have, you know, drafted all these t-shirts or whatever, where is that money going? Or how are we actually uplifting and supporting this community? Or who's been impacted by this? And why are we doing this? So again, it's just being very mindful of that and not driving a profit off of trauma, just in general, but especially not off of this crisis. And so to close tonight, before we get into questions, before we talk about the resources that we mentioned, I do just kind of, those of you who have attended my presentations before, you probably heard me talk about this, but I want to say leading with compassion, because we've lost a lot of that lately, right? Like, especially in the last year and a half, we have lost so much kindness, we have lost so much compassion. So I want to address everyone in individual groups here for a sec about applying this concept of compassion and how do we actually move forward to heal. So for oftentimes when we talk about the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis, the predominant reaction, unfortunately, that I hear from others is to point out all of the things that that Native person or that we as Native people have done wrong. We see this focus for some reason on our flaws or the circumstances that were beyond our control that we still have to deal with, right? Like when we talk about historical trauma. We see a lot of victim blaming a lot of time for our relatives who are missing and murdered. We see justification that somehow because they were sex trafficked or maybe had a substance abuse problem or were in a violent relationship or walked home alone or were in a dicey area or some other meaningless reason that somehow it's their fault. And we see a shift in the blame from the perpetrator to the victim. And so this first part of leading with compassion, I have to point out, is to recognize that at the end of the day, no matter what the circumstances are for a missing and murdered Indigenous person who's a victim, or for a survivor of intimate partner violence or human trafficking or sexual assault or any other trauma, is to recognize that these are human beings who deserve safety and respect above all else. And then I usually get the sentiment, when I mention this leading with compassion, I get it from others who are non-native, that they are too afraid to act or to get involved or to participate as an ally because they're worried that they're not going to be perfect. They're worried that they may learn that some of the things they're doing are harmful. They may mess up. And to that, I usually take the time to ask, and most of the time I'm begging you that you can at least try. We are never going to blame you for trying. So like I mentioned, we're not asking you to be our saviors. We are definitely not asking for that, but we are asking you to try. We are asking you to be open to learning and to committing to do better. Because like I said, we are not going to get through this. We are not going to end this crisis. I am not going to stop getting phone calls about losing our relatives until we get everybody on board. And I apologize that I am getting a little emotional right now. So I'm asking you to listen to us when we ask for help. I get that everybody's overwhelmed right now, right? We're dealing with a changing world, but we as Indigenous people, and really all Black, Indigenous, and people of color and others from marginalized communities, we are overwhelmed oftentimes for just existing. We don't feel safe in these systems. We don't feel safe in this world a lot of the time. And I cannot tell you how disheartening it is as a service professional trying to advocate for the safety of Native people, trying to advocate for these families, and being told on the other end that I am also not safe because I am Native, even though I work in the system. If I know how to navigate the system and I still don't feel safe and I'm still here, what does that tell you? Think about that. So while you may be safer, others are not. And so ask yourself how you can help to address that. How can you have empathy? How can you be kind? How can you lead with compassion and actually help us for the situation that we're dealing with? So again, I apologize. This has been a very, very hectic month. This is a very, very rough topic. So I want to move into, as we wrap up here, resources. So like I mentioned, having these phone numbers available at all times. And you will have access to these recordings, and I always have these resources, and we'll give a moment here to the tribal domestic violence programs. But you know, having things like the Strong Hearts Native Helpline, which is a 24/7 hotline specifically focused on providing culturally relevant services to Native American survivors of violence. This is invaluable. This is such a great resource that I wish had been around when I was in my initial stages of survival. Things like, you know, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, especially when we talk about trafficking. You know, trafficking can be a very dangerous situation to address, just like all of these other situations, but it can be especially complicated. And so having this phone number available so that professionals can take over and can address that crisis, it's extremely important that we have this accessible to folks. I now want to have Brooks Lasney, who is with the Ponca tribe domestic violence program. This is all of their contact information, but just to share a little bit about their program and some of the services that they provide. So Brooke, are you with us still? Okay, Andrea, I see you're also here. I know that sometimes you guys get calls, so Andrea, I'm gonna promote you to be a panelist, I think, maybe. Okay, Andrea, you should be able to unmute if you wanna share.
Hello, wait, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, sorry, I'm at home.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. I know Brooke and Andrea, I know they're at the office, but I'm kind of not sure on why they won't be able to unmute.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So who do we have with us?
This is Skylar Beavers. I am the domestic violence case manager out of the Ralston office for the Ponca tribe.
Awesome. Hi, Skylar.
Hi.
Do you want to just share a little bit about some of the services that you guys provide?
Yeah, I can. So, for the domestic violence program, we do have, of course, like the DV, we have human trafficking, we do have elder abuse, and then we have different, instead of like the Ponca tribe or like other tribes having a reservation, we just have service areas. So we do have different office locations, and we do serve 15 counties, I want to say, counting one in South Dakota and 2 counties in Iowa. There are offices, an office in Lincoln, an office in Niobrara, which is our headquarters, and then we have one in Norfolk and Sioux City. So we're kind of scattered around a little bit. I know Brooke for human trafficking, she does within Nebraska. And then we have a human trafficking case manager up in Sioux City, and she does Iowa and South Dakota. Was there anything else?
No, I think you did fantastic. Yeah. So
okay.
yeah,
Sorry.
thank you so much, Skylar. I really appreciate it. Yeah, like I know you guys get calls all the time, so I'm sure like
no, that's okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so the Ponca tribe is located all over. They like Skylar mentioned, they have a service delivery area. So really just making sure, you know, that you guys have access to advocacy. They also provide assistance with things like transportation and referrals to other programming. They also assist with things like protection orders, especially through the Ponca Tribal Court. So all of that is accessible as well. We also were very lucky to partner with the Santee DTSU domestic violence program. So this program is specifically providing services to Santee tribal members and those living on the Santee reservation. They provide advocacy, safety planning, transportation, referrals for programming. So they assistance with protection orders. So they are just, again, another valuable resource to Santee tribal members and for those up in that area. And then we also have partnered tonight with the Winnebago Tribe's Domestic Violence Intervention Program located on the Winnebago Reservation. And they also help other Winnebago tribal members and other tribal members of other tribes in the area. So they actually assist with things like advocacy, transportation referrals, programming, like I mentioned, assistance with protection orders. And then they also actually have a shelter, and their shelter is back open as far as I am aware, post-COVID sort of thing. So taking those safety measures and everything like that. So they've actually just been able to move into some different offices so they can open up more space in the shelter. So again, all of these programs are available. All of these programs are extremely helpful. Every single one of these programs, I have had the privilege, I consider it a privilege and an honor to work with them. So cannot recommend them enough for folks that you may come in contact with or for folks who may need assistance. And then there's also Legal Aid of Nebraska. So to talk a little bit about our organization, we are a statewide nonprofit law firm that provides free legal service to folks who typically don't have access to an attorney in an effort to promote equal access to justice. Within that, we have our Native American program, which serves enrolled or enrollment eligible Native Americans with legal matters they may have in tribal, state, or federal court here in Nebraska. They do not have to be a member of a Nebraska tribe. So as I mentioned, I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation, but I live in Nebraska, so I could still get assistance hypothetically through legal aid. We also have a very specific goal and focus and initiative to assist Native American survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and stalking with legal matters pertaining to their victimization. So assisting with things like protection orders, assisting with things like divorce or custody when they're fleeing an abusive situation. We also assist with things like housing. For missing and murdered Indigenous people, we have assisted families who remain and have lost their loved ones, but maybe need assistance with things like custody of children that remain or may need assistance navigating that situation. So we do just really try to be a resource to folks legally. And then we are, again, also lucky enough to partner with the tribal domestic violence programs here in the state to provide for referrals and to work together, because again, it's going to take all of us and it's going to take this collaborative approach before we're actually going to address this crisis. So this is our contact information that you all can have as well. But I just really want to say thank you all so much for joining us. tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for this series. I know this has been, as I've said multiple times, a hectic month. This is a tough topic, and we will continue to all work together. And I feel encouraged having as many people as we've had commit to this, to addressing this crisis, that I really do think that we're going to make an impact one day. And I just appreciate you all showing up. So with that, we will